Recording. Okay. So we're gonna have our final keynote. Dr. Merv Hickok, who is President and Research Director at Center for AI and Digital Policy. She's also Data Ethics Lecturer at the University of Michigan at the School of Information, the founder of AI Ethicist. She's a researcher, trainer, and consultant working on AI policy, governance, and regulation. She focuses on AI bias, impact of AI systems on fundamental rights, democratic values, and social justice, working with several nonprofit organizations globally to advance both the academic and professional research in the AI field for underrepresented groups. So we're really lucky to have her with us today. So welcome, Merv, to teach us a little bit about AI policy in the US and in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? All right. I'll correct the doctor, please. I'm not a doctor, but coming from a practitioner's perspective. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of my passion projects and passion work. I've been talking about working on AI ethics, trustworthy AI, responsible AI policy for a little over half a decade now. Previously, I was in the corporate world working on technology and diversity and inclusion. I'm going to skip all the introductions as you have kindly mentioned all of them. What I want to do today is kind of explain where I'm coming from, take a broader picture, a global picture, and then kind of quickly drill down to US and EU AI policy. I've been in a lucky place with my own practice at AIethicist.org to be able to go back and forth between research, theory, and practice and look at emerging practices, good practices. I'm not going to say there are any best practices in this space yet. Write about them, and then work with my clients kind of to experiment and practice some of these, put them into practice and operationalize, get the lessons learned, and then come back and write again more about this on the research end. But today, as I mentioned, I want to shift to the regulatory space and talk about AI policy and regulation, which is becoming a very heated topic. We've been shouting from the rooftops for years. Today, I'm waking every morning to new AI policy news. And even this morning, I couldn't be here for earlier conversations, earlier keynotes, because Sam Altman was testifying at Senate Judiciary Committee, so I had to listen to that, take notes, send my notes, etc. So let's look at the wider picture, and I want to start this conversation by providing an overview of one of our flagship reports, AI and Democratic Values Index. And then, like I said, drill down to US and EU. At the center, where I've been president and research director for a while now, our mission is very clear. We aim to ensure that AI and digital technologies promote a better society, more fair, more just, more accountable, a world where technology promotes broad social inclusion based on fundamental rights, democratic values, and rule of law. So in 2020, we embarked on this big project to put a longitudinal comparative analysis, and we've been doing this since 2020. And the goal was clear. Can we measure AI policies of countries against their practices? So if you commit to certain principles, you might have seen a lot of companies putting out their responsible AI, ethical AI principles. What do they do in practice? We want to do this at a nation level, country level. So if you commit to certain principles, what do you actually do in practice? We want this to be based on global norms, some of the main global norms and frameworks. We wanted to make sure that we had a way to compare that against, quantitatively, and then do that longitudinally so we can see the changes over time, which would allow us to keep the countries accountable, but also encourage these countries towards trustworthy AI, trustworthy and human-centric AI. So the first important framework that we had at hand was human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're asking if a country endorses the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the inalienable rights of humans, does it then center, if there's a commitment to human rights and human dignity, would they establish certain prohibitions, certain red lines where there is a fundamental conflict with rights and dignity? Would they provide certain bans? The second framework that we had at hand, or we decided to use, is the Universal Guidelines for AI. So this was developed back in 2018. What it does is it sets out certain rights for individuals and groups, and then certain obligations for organizations, whether those or deployers, developers and deployers, whether that is a country or a private company. So these were 2018, developed by more than 300 experts across 40 countries, and they eventually became the basis for OECD AI principles. Speaking of OECD AI principles, this is the third framework that we are using. It is the first global AI framework that was endorsed by countries themselves. Published in 2019. The efforts actually were led significantly by US at the time, and it is now endorsed by more than 50 countries. So countries are actually making a commitment to ensure that their domestic law, regulatory practices, and AI policies respect human rights, it is human-centered, trustworthy, and there are some accountability mechanisms. And then the final and the most recent framework that we included in the report is the UNESCO recommendations on AI, ethics of AI. So back in 2021, end of 21, this recommendations was endorsed by 193 UNESCO member states. It is a voluntary framework, but there are some reporting requirements for the countries. So it means that countries are committing to certain prohibitions, and then they're also making sure that their national AI strategies, policies, regulations, etc. respects that as well. So between those principles that I mentioned earlier and those four frameworks, what we had was 12 metrics, 12 questions that we could compare the national AI strategies and practices against. And thus was born the AI and Democratic Values Index. It was the first comparative study of national AI policies, first numeric evaluation, and then first ranking of nations based on those evaluations. And like I said, our mission is clear on democratic values, human rights, and rule of law. So it was one of those, instead of looking at research, publications, investment in AI, etc., our focus is very much on human rights and democratic values. And we couldn't have done this without the collaboration of more than 200 people in more than 60 countries. So these are the people, just a part of our collaborative efforts and researchers. Really grateful to them. And what we ended up is obviously not going to go into detail, but last month we published the third year of the report, analyzing national AI strategies and practices across 75 countries against those 12 questions, and which meant that each country had a final score with those questions, and then we were able to rank them and put them into 5 tiers. And then we also included main policy frameworks that I mentioned, as well as what's happening in Council of Europe, United Nations, EU, G7, African Union, Caribbean Roadmap, you name it. We ended up with 1,200 plus pages, 4,900 citations. It makes for great bedtime reading. But it is used by policymakers around the world as the main reference. The final scores, like I said, put countries in 5 tiers. this year, Canada, South Korea, Japan, and Colombia made the first year. With their practices, they're actually implementing their commitments. There was no European country in that first year, and US ended up being in the third tier. So there's a lot of room for development in US in terms of fundamental rights and democratic values. And now something that we mentioned, highlighted in the US report, the actual narrative report, is US still lacks strong privacy regulations, data privacy and data protection regulations. There's a very opaque policy-making process. There's not much public consultation, as there is in other countries. And then there's an urgency in US, especially for AI policymaking. So moving on from that report, kind of starting to drill down to what's happening, what has been happening in US and Europe. Kind of looking at the timeline, you now see a lot of conversations about regulations, impact of AI policy conversations, etc. But we need to look at the whole timeline and understand that this was actually a bipartisan effort, and it actually started around 2016. Big data report by the Obama White House was the first report of its kind coming out of the executive branch, looking at AI systems and algorithmic systems and their impact on society and our impact on civil rights, our ability to access resources and opportunities. And then in 2020, there was an executive order from the Trump administration on how to regulate AI for private companies. And then there was a second executive order on how to procure and use AI in federal governments in a trustworthy way. So you'll see this trustworthy, responsible AI theme across the different administrations. This actually has been one of the very few bipartisan areas when you look at the policy making. And then finally, 2022, I want to say October 2022, we saw the publication of Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights coming out of White House. So this was also a very important policy development. What the blueprint does is it establishes, again, just like universal guidelines, just like OECD AI principles, it establishes or highlights certain rights and obligations. And we're looking now to kind of push US AI policy and regulatory making into implementing the blueprint into actual law. When we look at the overall AI policy landscape in the US, I mentioned the top three, the two executive orders, the White House Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Those are the main conversations. But there's also a lot of warnings that are coming out from the existing federal agencies who have enforcement, investigation, and enforcement powers here in the US, such as Federal Trade Commission, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Department of Justice, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, etc. In fact, we had FTC last year warning companies to say, hold yourself accountable, otherwise be ready for the FTC to do it for you. This was was one of the most clear warnings to the companies. There has been a number of other warnings, most recently a couple on generative AI and chatbots, etc. But we are now seeing more of these agencies putting out these warnings saying, we are coming for you, we are going to come for you. You might start and get your shop together and clean. We have also seen a number of congressionally mandated commissions put out reports, do more research and put out reports. I'm going to go into slightly in more detail in a minute. We have, a couple of months ago, had NIST publishing its first version of AI risk management framework. It's a risk-based management framework on how do you develop, deploy, and govern AI systems. There is also more conversation about this framework to be operationalized within the US, and it is very much in alignment with the EU risk-based approach as well. Again, all of these, we see trustworthy, the word trustworthy AI, responsible AI repeating again and again and again, because there is an understanding that for AI to be adopted, for there to be more investment in AI, for it to be adopted by private companies, by governments, to be trusted by the wider public, so it can flourish and we can have more research and involvement in this, there needs to be trust. Every government around the world in their national AI strategies, in their legislations, underlines the fact that AI has to be trustworthy, and the companies and governments need to earn that trust. So how do you go about operationalizing that? I mentioned some of the federal congressionally mandated commissions. First one of these was National Security Commission on AI. It had a very strict and very defined mandate on what does AI mean within the national security and defense space. Although it was a very defined mandate for the commission, one of the remarks that they made was public trust will hinge on justified assurance that government use of AI will respect privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights. Governments must earn that trust and ensure that its use of AI tools is effective, legitimate, and lawful. So we're looking at, again, even from a national security and defense mandated commission, the importance of this, because everyone wants, for different reasons, everyone wants to have AI to be adopted. National AI research resource. They put out their report recently, back in January as well, looking at where is the research capabilities are concentrating in US and abroad. What does that mean for future? We are now seeing a lot of gatekeeping and a lot of the compute power, data power, etc., being concentrated in major tech companies and just a handful of academic labs. And even those are now kind of being aligned with corporations rather than independently working for us. So there is a lot of worry about this concentration of power, concentration of decision-making for within the research institute as well. So how can the federal government invest more research money, compute power, data, to ensure that AI is developed in an ethical, trustworthy, and equitable way? So it's not only a handful of people making decisions. I already mentioned the NIST risk framework. I'm not going to go into detail about it. And the last report that came out, let's say, a couple of weeks ago, was from the National AI Advisory Committee. So this committee's whole mandate is look at AI, benefits and risks, and then present a report to the president directly for recommendations on what needs to do. And they focused on 4 thematic areas. Again, leadership in trustworthy AI, leadership in research and development, supporting US workforce, so how do you build upskill and skill building, and international collaboration. And then I'm really grateful to the president for, it has become now a monthly update from him, monthly push from him to repeat his policy direction on AI. He has been calling, the administration has been calling for ex-ante guardrails for AI, meaning that organizations need to ensure that the systems that they are going to deploy needs to meet some certain guidelines before it can be deployed, and that the organizations should be accountable and responsible for their activities. And all of this should be done in a way to protect fundamental rights and democratic values as well. Congress is also picking up activity. I was honored to be in the first congressional hearing, testifying at the Congress a couple of months ago, talking about where we are with AI policy in the US and what needs to happen. So again, my message was that we don't have the guardrails in place that the president is asking about. We've been saying that for long years. We don't have the laws in place. enough laws in place or updated laws in place, the public education or the expertise in the government to do the oversight and actually oversight and enforcement that we need. Today, I missed the earlier conversations this morning at the symposium because there was a Senate Judiciary hearing where Sam Altman was testifying, answering questions from the senators. So the conversations are certainly picking up, and it's great to see that that timeline of bipartisan policymaking on trustworthy AI is also now continuing on both the House and the Senate side, that there is a bipartisan agreement on the urgency of regulation, on the urgency of regulating in a way that trustworthy AI needs to be operationalized, civil rights need to be protected, existing agencies should be empowered, and there's probably need for there's definitely need for guardrails, and that there is also a need for possibly a separate agency. Whether that is a good idea or not, we can discuss. While we have been repeating the urgency of this, obviously ChatGPT caught up with us in our policy conversations. While we're talking about new regulations, new policy, we also think that there are a lot of regulations. So GDPR for example, in Europe, and FTC and similar agencies with investigation and enforcement power in the US. So we have put out back in March submitted a 46-page complaint on OpenAI to the Federal Trade Commission, asking for investigation. I'm not going to go into all the details of the complaint, but the items that we had laid out within the FTC mandate as a consumer protection bureau or agency is consumer protections, public safety, children's safety, bias, cybersecurity, privacy, transparency, unfair and deceptive practices. So we have laid out our argument as well as examples of what actually happened between rollout and our complaint with examples. So we're looking to, waiting for FTC to open that investigation. But in the meantime, other countries which have national or federal privacy regulations and data protection regulations have also started using their existing agencies and laws in an effort to understand and kind of regulate the space. So Canadian Privacy Commissioner has started an investigation on OpenAI, on ChatGPT. Italian regulators, you might have already heard about the Garante ban that temporarily banned it and then kind of said the corrections or the developments into opt-in, opt-out methods were enough. French privacy doc CNIL is looking into investigating. Spain opened an investigation. German regulators, privacy commissioners also started an investigation. And then the last piece was the European Privacy Watchdog, European Data Protection Board, which is the EU-wide board, said it is going to start a task force. It is going to roll out a task force on generative AI systems, looking to investigation, and that kind of explained why Garante pulled back its ban, because it became a bit political. Now everything is going to go into the ADPB investigation and task force. So shifting from US to Europe, mindful of time, what we have in the European side and within the wider landscape is some of the main AI policy and regulatory conversations is Council of Europe is currently working on an international treaty on how to regulate AI. So it will be, for those of you who might be familiar with Budapest Convention or Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, Convention 108 plus on data protection. So those were international conventions that came out of the Council of Europe, which is a totally separate body from European Union. So we are now working on at Council of Europe to draft that committee, to draft that convention. What it means, I'm going to go into the details of EU AI Act, TTC, and briefly mention the case law. But let me start with the Council of Europe. So the Council of Europe has 46 member states. So you have the EU member states, and then you have the likes of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, United Kingdom, etc. So those are the member states in addition to European members. And then there are 6 observer states, US, Israel, Canada, Japan, Mexico, and Holy See, Vatican. Those are the observer states. So between those two, back in 2019, there was a mandate coming from the Council of Europe to start this committee, look at the feasibility of creating this legal instrument of a convention, possibly a convention on AI, and what would that look like? What will be the elements of it? So since 2019, we've been working. My organization is an expert civil society organization in that committee. So we've been working in that committee since 2019 to kind of look at what would it look like, what should be the elements. End of 2021, the mandate finished. We submitted that it should be a legally binding international convention based on the mandate of Council of Europe, so human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And it should be open to participation by non-member states, just like the previous conventions were. So that rolled out into a new committee on AI. And since the beginning of 2020, we've been working on actually drafting word by word what that convention should look like. So I've been shuttling back and forth between Ann Arbor and Strasbourg for the better part of this past year. When it becomes a convention, it will be open to all the countries around the world who are not members of Council of Europe. So it has the potential to be a legal international convention, and it will put obligations on the countries, on the member states, to update their regulations, domestic regulations, in line with this convention. So when it is a convention, when a country signs it, it will mean that they are going to update their regulations as well. And then the final piece was it should consider other existing regulations and upcoming efforts. Reading between the lines, that actually means what's happening in UNESCO, what's happening with OECD, and what's happening with EU AI Act. What is happening with EU AI Act? Very quickly, if you're not familiar with the European legislative process, European Union has 3 bodies: the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. So European Commission always puts out this draft legislation. They are the ones coming up with this draft legislations when they are mandated. When they put it out, it goes into 2 separate parallel tracks. One is with the Parliament, European Parliament. The other is with the European Council, so Council of the European Union, different from the Council of Europe that I just mentioned. The Parliament assigns different committees who should be responsible for amending, discussing, etc., moving this forward. And then the Council actually has the ministers who looks at it from a Council angle. And then they discuss internally. They don't speak to each other during that period. One discusses internally, other discusses internally. They do stakeholder engagement, etc. And then they vote on their amendments and what their position should be. So Council voted on its position back in December. European Parliament committees voted last Thursday. And then the European Parliament now is going to go to the bigger Parliament for vote sometime in June. And then once the Parliament votes and adopts a position, they will come back. All 3 of them are going to come back and start this trilogue process. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. And then eventually we're going to have a EU AI Act. What it does is introduces this risk-based system. And at the very top, there are some prohibited use cases. And then there's a list of high-risk use cases that I can talk about, such as biometric identification, critical infrastructure, education, employment, law enforcement, migration, asylum, and border control, and election process, etc. So if you're a high risk, if you're a provider or a developer for a high-risk system, you have a number of obligations that I'm going to mention very quickly. And then there are less risky systems, as they put it, that has some other obligations. Let's assume that you're one of the providers or developers of these high-risk systems. You have to conduct a self-assessment, what they call a conformity assessment. So look at the risks of what you're going to roll out, make sure that you have all the data, governance, and technical documentation on both your data, your data quality statements and analysis, your model analysis, your risk identification, mitigation. You need to have an ongoing risk management system. There are some explainability expectations. And then once you do all of this, you're supposed to upload all your information into a European database, which will then give you an affixation, EC conformity affixation. And then you need to have actual person representation in EU, and then need to align with certain code of conduct. Not clear what that code of conduct should look like at the moment. And standard setting bodies are now looking at what those conformity assessments, technical and model documentation, etc. should be. So there's a lot of work in the standard setting bodies as well. We, as civil society, the last 3 years have been pushing for changes, a number of changes in the EU AI Act. So there was a lot of ex-ante exclusions. What that means is a number of big systems, especially those like Frontex that manages the borders in Europe, that manages all the asylum, refugee, etc. Processing, as well as country, member state, and information sharing. That was altogether excluded. There were a lot of exceptions and exclusions for law enforcement. Law enforcement, on paper, it looked like there were some restrictions on their activity. When you started going into the rabbit hole of the definitions, etc., there were a lot of exclusions. And we asked for several additional bans: ban on predictive policing, biometric categorization, emotion analysis, the expansion of facial surveillance ban. So there were already 2 bans in there on social scoring by public actors. We wanted to expand that to private actors too. There was a ban already on facial recognition used by law enforcement in public spaces. We wanted to enhance that as a facial surveillance ban altogether. Interestingly enough, there was no access to remedies, or there was no private right of action when the draft first came out, which was a big lack of a serious right. And then there was not enough protections on people with disabilities or environmental impact. A lot of focus on individual impact, but not like societal or group level impact. And then there wasn't anything, or there wasn't much on misinformation, etc. Most of these asks have made it in. So we were actually celebrating last week, because when the committees voted on the changes last week, before they take their amendments to the parliament, most of these changes that we asked actually made it. So now we have fingers and everything crossed that those stay in. When the parliament votes it in June, and then during the trilogue process, it doesn't get watered down. I'll skip this. No need to go into the actual European lawmaking for this conversation. But then I try to finalize it with what's happening. So we have the EU, we have the US, we have the Council of Europe. Are they actually working together? Is there any transatlantic alignment? We are seeing a lot of that happening in the last 2 years as well. Usually, or formerly, historically, it had been like this clash between the two. Europe putting a lot of legislation in place, US more protective of the companies. Since 2020-21 period, there's more conversation on transatlantic alignment. There's even a work group called TTC, US-EU Trade and Technology Council, who are working on these conversations with a mandate that innovation needs to be trustworthy, respective of universal human rights and democratic values. So I'm doing this full circle where we started with our report and how this is all coming together and becoming embedded in some of these policy conversations as well. And one thing I would say is we are starting, like I said, a lot of heat on the policy and regulatory framework, and even companies now are asking for more regulation. One, they understand that there's a lot of impact of what they're deploying out, but they also want a framework of what they can do and not kind of do this like Wild West, because they understand that there's going to be more liability and accountability coming their way. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to take more questions here or at the panel.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We're ready. Some hands raised.
Yeah, can I just really simple question for I really appreciate your talk. A lot of interesting things, but for the purposes of the EU policy, of US policy, what defines an AI and when does a decision system or a computational system not be defined as an AI in the scope of these systems? Is it scale? Is it speed? Is it complexity? Is it data use case? Where's the boundary of AI?
Yeah, so there's over the years of conversation, we are now seeing a convergence on the definition. EU started when the EU AI Act first came out. They had their own definition, but in the last couple of years, they started moving to the OECD AI, the definition within the OECD AI principles. We have seen that now in kind of starting that shift in Council of Europe work as well. And then US, who has been, as I mentioned, one of the leading actors with OECD AI principles, is also pushing that kind of definition. And more clearly, we saw that with the NIST. So NIST is the National Institute for Standards of Technology. When they came out with their AI risk management framework, there was also that walk across with the definitions on the OECD. So there are a lot of convergence with the OECD AI definition, where we are seeing a more bigger question as how they define general purpose AI, foundational models, and generative AI. So the conversation has now shifted more to those, because kind of last minute, over the last 6 months, those made their way into the EU AI Act as well. So there's going to be some regulation around that. But as OECD defines it, it is a machine-based system using a lot of using supervised and unsupervised learning with certain objectives, a system that uses a lot of data and interacts with its environment and changes its environment. So there's a bit of a socio-technical element in that definition as well. But I think ultimately everything is going to converge on that OECD definition.
Thank you. Questions? Okay.
You said that most of the suggestions, the civil society requests, made it into the draft EU Act. Are you at liberty to share which ones didn't, out of curiosity?
Sure. So I am at liberty because it's now public, but like I said, there's a European Parliament-wide voting, and then the trilogue process starts. So removal of ex-ante exclusions, those are now in. So the systems like Frontex or other existing systems that are already deployed, but there's going to be a grandfathering period, which looks like a 4-year period after the legislation comes into effect. Exceptions and inclusions for law enforcement, there has been a lot of narrowing of exclusions, but I would have to, there's a lot to cover there, and even their definition of law enforcement is not like what you immediately think of uniformed police. So even public transport authority who's managing the queues in a bus station can be considered as a law enforcement. So we've been pushing as like a more narrow definition on that. Predictive policing is banned through the committees. Hopefully it stays that way. Biometric categorization is banned. Biometric identification for real-time and ex-post use is now limited to very narrow law enforcement investigation context. Emotion recognition is banned for law enforcement, border management, workplace, and education. So you're not going to have emotion recognition systems, analysis systems trying to figure out if you're trustworthy or not at workplace or at the borders. Facial surveillance ban, that has expanded, like I said, or not so much expanded, but the exceptions for law enforcement has narrowed, so I will take that as a win. Social scoring by private actors, that is a win, so it's now both public and private actors. Access to remedy individual access to remedy is now included, but we're still pushing for a collective, so a civil society should be able to access remedy on behalf of impacted groups or communities as well. That is still not in there. Alignment with the rights of people, whether that is defined within the EU Charter or the Convention for People with Disabilities, that is also making its way. There are a lot of at least accessibility requirements now, although the way that we define rights of people with disabilities and how they interact with AI systems is not limited to accessibility. There is now an environmental impact assessment requirement, transparency requirement. Misinformation has kind of moved into the generative AI, general purpose AI conversations, and then group discrimination has kind of became like a data governance, AI model governance conversation. So looking at, do you have any adverse impact or negative results, unfair results for certain groups? So that became more of a technical thing. And then let me see if I quickly, so I had some extra slides. So yeah, high risk. One thing that we're not happy, which can create a lot of loopholes and like backdoor exceptions, is they included this qualifier of how you should be. If you have a significant risk with your AI systems, then you're subject to all those requirements. However, the assessment of whether your system is a high risk or significant risk is still a self-assessment. So they put out this severity, intensity, probability, duration. Does it have an impact on individuals or groups as like a high-level definition? But if I'm an AI provider, developer, and I can say, I don't think I'm a significant impact. It's like I manage this. I don't see any for risks, etc. And that negates all the technical documentation and all the obligations. So we are asking for a clearer definition of those, and not the self-assessment. There needs to be clearer assessments. And then there's a new requirement on the deployer. So EU AI Act has this provider, who is the organization, whether it's government or private, who develops it. And then the deployer is, I bought the software, I'm deploying it. So for those deployers, there's now a new requirement on fundamental rights impact assessment and notification to the regulator. So even if the providers did not, might not have assessed themselves as such, if I'm a deployer and if I see a significant risk, I should still be doing the fundamental rights impact, not risk assessment, fundamental rights impact assessment, and notify the regulators. So those are the ones that there are some on generative AI and general purpose and foundation models, etc., that I can go into more detail later. But like I said, right now we're in a kind of a celebratory mode, but hoping that, because the trial process is going to take another year or so, so we're hoping that it stays the way it is and improves with those additional asks as well.
Thank you.
All right. David?
Mike, do you have a...
Oh.
There we go.
Okay.
Hi, David Corliss, GM. Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. I'd love to talk more, like a lot more, so I'll be getting in touch with you. But the short question is, I think it's a short question, these are the regulations. What does enforcement look like? What triggers it? How does it happen? Is there a website you can, I know there's not an agency in the US, we were just talking about that. But is there how do we initiate an investigation if there's concern? How is that different from Europe? Because they seem to be so much further ahead. Can we follow what Europe is doing?
Ideally, would love to have a federal level privacy law and data protection law. So that's right now, that is what the EU data protection agencies and the countries are depending on, and they're doing the investigation and enforcement through that. Not an ideal. I'm not,
So there's a law in Europe and an agency.
Yes. So there is the GDPR, and GDPR requires each country to have a DPA, data protection agency. Then there is the EU-level data protection board for across those agencies, and there is a single European data protection supervisor that actually looks at the government's use of data as well. So, and they can do together investigations together, pass along, hold each other accountable. Ireland tends to be like the outlier in all of the investigation cases. In the US, since we don't have a federal privacy regulation, we don't have a DPA, a lot is FTC, FCC, EEOC, SEC is doing a lot of carrying right now, hence our complaint to FTC, for example, for OpenAI. So, further regulation in the US could look at more enforcement and investigation powers for those existing agencies. And this morning's Senate Judiciary Committee, there was a lot of discussion about a new agency that kind of cuts horizontal across those, specifically with a mandate on AI. So we'll see.
Another question there. Where are we?
Thank you. Yes, if I turn it on. Okay, thank you. Can I turn it on? Okay, yeah. I have kind of two questions, I would say. Like, I'll try to keep them both short. So one of them is for recommender systems, as your current slide shows. Do you think the polarization kind of things which are happening because of social media platform recommendation systems, is that under the purview of the policies? That's my first one.
Let me quickly answer that. One thing I did not mention here was Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. Those are the two regulations that I have not gone into because I have a lot on my other portfolio. But those are the ones that are actually regulating the platforms, the big platforms. So they are already in effect. So whereas I've been talking about stuff on the table right now, these two are actually effect. So more, and they have some auditing requirement as well. I want to say DSA I think has independent audit requirements as well. So, but don't quote me on those two.
Okay.
I haven't gone into detail.
I mean, good to know that there are efforts. The second thing was, it looks like policymakers are more reacting.
Yes.
How late are we, and is there something to be done before much damage has been done or something? Right. So,
in the US, we're extremely late. And there has been more of a U.S. Corporate protection or protection of the corporations and laissez-faire approach, I would say. Like I said, we've been asking for AI regulation for years now. Things only started picking up with GPT-4 being unleashed to the mainstream, and it did two things. One, obviously, a lot of people started interacting, mainstream population started interacting with it, so it got a lot of attention. That included attention of the policymakers as well. But the second thing it did was it broke the gates open for other companies. So when you see like the deployment time with OpenAI, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, etc., and BARD, what Google, Microsoft, and others are doing, I don't think they were aligning their timelines to come like a week after each other. One, OpenAI opened the gates, said, I'm going to unleash this to the society. And then Google and others started being more reactive to that, and they've been deploying their products without controls. I talked to a lot of the people in the teams within those companies, and they are extremely frustrated that the things that have been built on responsible AI, transferred AI for years, have been crumbling because the company is now pushing a lot of this. So we are very late. Coming back to your question, in US, we're very late, but I am at least happy to see the current interest. One thing I would caution is some of the proposals, like a new federal agency, let's make rulemaking and RFIs, federal RFIs and rulemaking process, etc. All of those are going to delay policymaking and regulation making in the US further. As I mentioned, US has led OECD AI principles. We have civil rights protections. We have the agencies. We have the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. We have the executive orders. We don't need to invent the wheel. It's more important to implement those into regulation, into existing agencies, and into regulation, and update our civil rights regulation rather than discussing this again and again and again. So great to have interest, just don't need to be in this loop of exploration constantly.
Thank you so much. We're gonna hold on to your question. We're gonna go to our discussion panel right now, and you can ask your question. Another round of applause for our presenters. Thank you so much.